If sense is to be made of the tragedies that are aviation disasters, it is in the lessons that can be learned to prevent future incidents. The first step is determining what went wrong. Follow the investigators as they seek the probable cause.
Without a doubt, commercial flying is the safest mode of transportation. But what happens when something goes wrong? We are at once fascinated by and fearful of what happened and why. The crash itself, front page news. But what about the investigation? And that's what this is all about. The accident investigators. Their search for what happened and why is both painstaking and precise. They have to deal with a lot of factors: weather, design flaws, or mechanical failure. But we're also going to look at the most perplexing of all, the human factor. Spain's Canary Islands are located off the coast of North Africa, 250 nautical miles out in the Atlantic. With its beautiful beaches and fine resorts, the Canaries are a year-round tourist destination. Las Palmas, on the main island of Gran Canaria, is home to the region's principal airport. Sunday is a busy day for travelers to and from the islands, and for those in transit to other destinations. On Sunday, March 27, 1977, Pan Am Flight 1736 was heading to Las Palmas with 234 passengers. They were coming to meet the Golden Odyssey, bound for a Mediterranean cruise. That morning, while the Pan Am flight was still en route, a bomb had exploded in a flower shop at the Las Palmas air terminal. It had been planted by a group of radical separatists. After the blast, authorities immediately closed the airport. All incoming flights were diverted to the smaller airfield on Tenerife Island, approximately 50 miles to the northwest. Two of those flights were Pan Am 1736 and KLM Flight 4805, inbound from Amsterdam. The small airport at Tenerife perches atop a high plateau. It had no ground radar. Given its elevation, low clouds often roll through, enveloping the tarmac in thick, fog-like conditions. Fast-changing weather blowing in off the sea can quickly turn Tenerife's overcast into a driving rain. It was early afternoon, and the clouds thickened. Visibility dropped. Planes diverted from Las Palmas were now stacked on the ramps and taxiways, pushing Tenerife's limited capacity to the utmost. And aircraft waiting for clearance were forced to delay. In fact, both KLM and Pan Am waited for hours. This Pan Am plane, dubbed Clipper Victor, was one of the very first of the Boeing 747 jumbo jets. Two veteran pilots were at the controls. And the KLM 747, christened the Flying Dutchman, was piloted by Jacob Van Zanten. Van Zanten was one of KLM's senior and most trusted pilots. In fact, he was so well respected that he was regularly featured in KLM's advertising. He flew KLM's first 747 and had trained most of the 747 pilots in the KLM fleet, including his own first officer on Flight 4805. Van Zanten decided to take advantage of the delay and refuel his plane at Tenerife instead of waiting to refuel at Las Palmas before returning to Amsterdam. Finally, just before 5 p.m., the tower instructs both KLM and Pan Am to taxi.
We were instructed to contact you and also to taxi down the runway. Is that correct? Affirmative. Taxi onto the runway and...
Due to congestion on the taxiway, both the Flying Dutchman, now loaded to capacity with jet fuel, and the Pan Am Clipper Victor are directed onto the main runway and told to taxi all the way down, 11,000 feet, in order to get into position for takeoff. The Flying Dutchman is then asked to taxi to the end of the runway and turns to position for takeoff.
Okay, at the end of the runway, make 180 and report.
Then, the tower orders Clipper Victor to exit the runway via the third turn to the left.
Third to the left? Okay. Third one on your
The Pan Am crew elects to bypass that difficult turn at the third taxiway, sure that the controller was directing them toward the more gradual turn.
The third one, sir. 1, 2, 3.
Inside the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Zanten begins the final takeoff procedure.
KL 4805 is now ready for takeoff.
But Clipper Victor is still taxiing down the runway.
We are still taxiing down the runway.
And yet, without explanation, the KLM jet suddenly begins to roll.
Let's get the hell right out of here. Yeah, he's anxious, isn't he? After he's held
Seconds later, the Pan Am flight crew looks up, and the Dutchman's lights are barreling down at them through the fog.
Yes, look at him! God damn, that son of a bitch is coming! Get on him! Get on him!
The two jumbo jets collide. Two jumbo jets collide on the runway in the Canary Islands. It is the worst disaster in aviation history. The ironic thing is that neither airplane even left the ground. How did that happen? The investigators at first were confused. The Pan Am crew had desperately tried to get off the runway, but it was too late. The Dutchman was rolling down the runway too fast to stop and too slow to get airborne. Van Zanten tried to lift off, but his tail dug a 6-foot trench into the tarmac. He never really got the jumbo jet into the air. As the Clipper swerved left, the KLM plane smashed across the fuselage, midship, shearing off the top of the plane, igniting a fire in the Pan Am first class lounge. The KLM 747 crashed and exploded into the tarmac 500 yards down the runway. Captain Van Zanten and the flight crew, as well as the passengers, all 248 aboard, perished instantly. On the flight deck of the Pan Am jet, Captain Victor Grubbs had reached up to pull the fire handle, but there was nothing there. The top of the plane had been sheared right off. The flight crew were lucky to be among the few to escape the devastation, where in one instant, more than 500 people died aboard the two jumbo jets. One eyewitness was reporter Gustavo Arwas.
Un grupo de periodistas estábamos almorzando.
It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I was having lunch with a group of journalists. Someone called with the news about the crash. At first, I thought it was a joke. Then I looked out of the window and saw a column of smoke rising up.
Manuel Fandinho was also there that day.
Entonces sentimos un ruido. Y ya vino la gente, pues vimos.
We heard the noise and saw the smoke. I grabbed my camera and I jumped on the back of someone's motorbike. We went up to one of the hills nearby and I started taking photographs. But then I rushed down to try to help and to save people.
Me subí arriba, yo vitnaba un poquito, empecé a sacar fotografías, bueno.
Within moments of the disaster, phones started ringing. At Pan Am headquarters in New York, at the KLM offices in Holland, at the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C., in Spain, and in newsrooms around the world. Another journalist, Enrique Ray Pitti, will never forget that scene.
It was horrific. A scene from Dante's Inferno. There were shoes, suitcases scattered everywhere. There was an engine here, a piece of fuselage there, and the stench was horrific.
But what exactly had happened? No one knew. Among the first to be notified was Dutch investigator Bruno Clara.
Two 747s hitting each other. The first rumor was maybe, I guess, one landed on top of the other one. That was one of the rumors I heard. I can hardly believe that. Your mind is racing through all the possibilities. What could have happened? What is going on over there?
Clara and his team boarded an empty 747 at Schiphol Airport near Amsterdam. 4.5 hours later, they were in Las Palmas. But they still had to find a way to get to Tenerife.
Oh, that was an awful thing. They rented an old helicopter, and I don't like helicopters. You could hardly see, but certain areas were lighted and people were clearing bodies and all that sort of things. That's your first impression. It's not a nice one.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board soon joined Clara and others to form an international go team. The investigators had to wait while the victims' bodies were recovered and moved to a makeshift morgue in an empty hangar.
Sun is coming up and then you get a better view and they see this awful mess.
The total dead? 583.
You see the engines all over the place. Our first intention was to find The black boxes.
The black boxes could reveal much about what the two planes and their flight crews were doing in the critical moments before they collided. NTSB audiologist Jim Cash.
What we commonly get off of the voice recorder, most of what we get is the crew conversations, which is, the crew interactions, what they're doing to manage the airplane. Sometimes we use the background sounds that are recorded, since one of the channels is an open area microphone in the cockpit, picks up any sounds that are in the cockpit.
As they searched, the investigators discovered something very unusual.
There was a skid mark on the runway. Normally, you don't find such a skid mark on the runway.
In an attempt to avoid the Pan Am plane, the Flying Dutchman had tried to take off. NTSB investigator Dick Rodriguez explains.
When he rotated, he over-rotated and the tail had struck and dragged for, I don't remember now, 60 meters or something like that.
The investigators soon located the black boxes. All evidence pointed to pilot error. But which pilot? The investigators began to question the air traffic controllers who'd been on duty in the Tenerife Tower. They questioned the surviving members of the Pan Am crew. Pan Am co-pilot Robert Bragg told investigators what he saw.
We saw the lights moving, and the captain said, I think he's moving, and at about the same time we saw the airplane, and the captain went to full takeoff power on the throttles. It wasn't just an instant later that he hit us.
But without the in-flight recorders for comparison, none of this testimony could be verified. With the black boxes in hand, Bruno Clara accompanied the NTSB team back to Washington. They went to work in what were the NTSB's state-of-the-art laboratories, trying to extract the truth of what had happened from the flight data recorders and the cockpit voice recorders.
Okay.
I've been in Washington for about 4 weeks, listening to the tapes, looking at all the graphs coming from the flight data recorder.
The big question on everyone's mind was how could such an experienced senior pilot like Van Zanten, flying for an airline with such a superb safety record, commence his takeoff without the proper clearance? Slowly, the investigators pieced together the events that led to the disaster. NTSB investigator Dick Rodriguez explains.
They were using what they call back taxi. You taxi out onto the runway, go down to the end, and then turn around for takeoff. At the same time that they were turning around, Pan Am was cleared down the runway to exit on one of the angular taxiways and then continue to the end of the runway on a taxiway.
With the Pan Am 747 following from behind, the KLM airliner reached the end of the runway and began its 180-degree turn.
We were instructed to contact you and also to taxi down the runway. Is that correct? Affirmative. Taxi on
The tower
runway.
instructed the Pan Am 747 to turn off the runway and onto a taxiway, but there was some confusion.
How many taxiway did you pass?
To clear the active runway was not the best solution for a 747. Because a turn like this, and the next one was a turn like this, which is much more easy for a big 747.
Pan Am had not yet reached the taxiway when KLM was given their airway clearance.
KL 4805 is now ready for takeoff. We're waiting for our ATC clearance. KL 4805, you are clear to the pop-up beacon. Climb to and maintain flight level 9.
Captain Van Zanten, piloting KLM 4805, assumed he had been cleared for takeoff and began to roll.
Until intercepting the 325. We're now at takeoff.
Within the crew itself, there was a question by the flight engineer, is he clear of the runway?
And you hear Pan Am calling,
We are still taxiing down the runway.
we are still on the runway. Why did the KLM start its takeoff roll? And then you hear the KLM tape.
Okay.
And then 2 seconds nothing, and then the squeal starts.
Transmissions between the three parties, the tower and the two 747s, the transmission about being on the runway was interrupted or tramped on, so you got a squeal, and the KLM crew did not fully understand it.
And after, of course, if you listen 150 times to that same fragment, then you can hear in the squeal, okay, stand by for takeoff. The first time, nobody of us noticed it. And after listening again, we said, well, if you really know what you should hear, then very faint you can hear it.
And the captain did not respond to that. They simply continued the takeoff and collided about midfield.
Van Zetten's posthumous reputation was on the line. He was a senior pilot and an 18-year veteran. But as the man who trained most of KLM 747 crews, Van Zetten had been spending more hours in flight simulators than in actual airplane cockpits. The investigators also suspected that Van Zetten hurried his takeoff in order to meet KLM's strict limits on the maximum amount of time a crew could be on duty.
No way. He slowed it down.
The investigators could not find any evidence on the tape that Van Zetten was rushing. They then turned their attention to the control tower at Tenerife. After listening to the tapes, some investigators suggested that the tower personnel weren't paying enough attention to what was going on out on the runway. There was even a report that the Tenerife airport director had screamed that two men in the tower were more interested in a local soccer match than their overcrowded airstrip. There were even some eyewitness reports that a portable radio was dropped out of the tower in an attempt to hide evidence of that broadcast.
And one of the guys on the airport confirmed that the guys were listening to this football match, but we could not find them at that time.
The investigators also found that two other factors had contributed to the disaster: limited visibility and a failure of the runway light system.
KLM asked the tower to turn on the runway lights, or the centerline lights, so they could count them and get the exact visibility out at takeoff and make sure they had their minimums. The centerline lights, as a matter of fact, were out. They were inoperative, and so they did not have that measure of how far can we see down the runway.
Adding to the confusion, Tenerife's runways were not well marked. The Pan Am crew, facing a difficult, extremely sharp turn onto taxiway 3, may have thought that the tower really wanted them to proceed to the next turnout, where the turn angle was better suited to a big 747. The other culprit may well have been simple misunderstanding. By custom, English is the accepted common language for worldwide aviation. But with air traffic controllers and pilots trying to communicate in non-native languages, miscommunication is always a possibility. Add the thick accents of non-English speakers, and the level of possible confusion soars.
Clear for takeoff.
When he established they were ready for takeoff, he said, okay. There was a pause and then standby for takeoff. And the point I would make is that both the KLM crew and the tower controller were using second language of English to make the clearance.
There was yet another factor contributing to the disaster: ambiguous terminology.
That was one of those things we were not sure.
Some investigators thought he said, "We are at takeoff." Others thought he said, "We are taking off."
I mean, we could not get one single opinion on what was said.
Bad weather, poor visibility, a crowded airfield, distracted air controllers, ambiguous terminology, and miscommunication all conspired to lead seasoned, experienced pilots into making fatal errors. As the investigation ended, the only significant question that remained was, what can we do so that the tragedies like this one would never happen again? Here's what has happened since Tenerife. Dutch investigator Henk Voleswinkel explains how it should work, with simple and precise terminology.
When you were ready for takeoff, you said, "We are ready for takeoff." And they changed that. Nowadays, when you are clear of runway, you report runway vacated. And when you are ready for takeoff, you say, "We are ready for departure."
Even if the speaker has a very thick accent, the difference between saying runway vacated and ready for departure is easily discernible. In addition, there's now a distinct time interval between transmissions of an airways clearance, which tells the crew the route it will be flying, and a takeoff clearance, which signals the crew to begin rolling for takeoff. Major airports in the United States began using ground sweeping radar designed to penetrate the haze that obscured so many runways. There's even the search for an affordable anti-misting fuel. Consider these tests of the effects of escaping fuel during a controlled scientific accident. In this situation, a fine mist is formed, and when mixed with the rushing air of the moving plane, it turns it into an explosive bomb. After Tenerife, these changes began to go into effect around the world. but not in the United States. 13 years later, after a similar collision between two planes on a foggy runway in Detroit, the necessary changes were finally instituted. Former NTSB investigator David Kelly.
One of the 6 fatal collision accidents on the runway that we've had in the United States since 1990 involved 2 Northwest aircraft at Detroit. The weather was restricted visibility, and one of the flight crews got disoriented and inadvertently encroached out on the runway, while the other Northwest aircraft had been cleared for takeoff. And they struck in the middle of the runway, and there were fatalities.
The center runway 321 was below minimums. Although the captain started to stop and call the tower for help 2 or 3 times, the first officer in each case would encourage, oh, I see where we are, oh, here's Oscar 4, or whatever they were looking for. They got out there and saw the runway lights, the white lights that indicate you're on a runway. Then it was too late. The 727, who had taxied out earlier and was then cleared for takeoff.
The FAA started categorizing runway incursions with letter grades.
A being the most serious, with the highest risk or potential for a collision, and D being a somewhat benign occurrence. Well, the FAA refers to Category A and B runway incursions as major.
Changes have been implemented to further reduce the incidence of runway incursions.
Out of the Northwest case, we came to establish standardized runway and taxiway markings for signage to identify, as well as stop marks and hold bars to make it perfectly clear when you're approaching a runway and where you should stop.
And there are more improvements on the horizon.
The research has been done. NASA's got this. I've ridden on their plane. They need to base this on global positioning surveillance of all aircraft operating on the airport surface. And those aircraft need to be utilizing automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. It's referred to as ADS-B, where they broadcast to all other aircraft their location, their heading, their acceleration, and other data.
There are many lessons from the collision at Tenerife. Some of those lessons may seem simple, but that can often mean the difference between a routine takeoff and a disaster. And though these lessons were learned at a terrible cost, it led to changes that have greatly reduced the risk of such a catastrophe ever happening again. It stands to reason that large cities tend to have more traffic, both automobile and aircraft. But as that air traffic increases, so does the margin for human error. Southern California has nearly ideal flying weather year-round. It is also known for having the highest concentration of general aviation aircraft in the world. It was 9:01 a.m. on September 25, 1978. The skies were busy over San Diego's Lindbergh Field. Departing Los Angeles International for a short 20-minute hop to San Diego, Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182, a Boeing 727, was descending through 11,000 feet and on approach to Lindbergh Field. Visibility was excellent.
PSA on 82's clear visual approach, runway 27.
Thank you, cleared visual approach 27.
A Cessna 172, a light aircraft, had departed Montgomery Field, a private airport 8 miles to the south, and was practicing instrument landing approaches to Lindbergh.
PSA 182, traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile northbound.
We're looking.
There's a lot of aviation traffic in that area for air traffic controllers to monitor.
PSA 182, additional traffic, 12 o'clock, 3 miles just north of the field, northwest bound. Cessna 172 climbing VFR at 1,400.
Okay, we got that at the 12th.
Inside the PSA cockpit, there was some confusion.
Are we clear that Cessna? Supposed to be, I guess.
But they weren't clear. The Cessna, climbing while the PSA 727 was descending, had flown right into the jet from behind it, clipping its right wing.
We're hit, man, we're hit. Oh, we're going down. This is PSA.
The crippled 727 was now trailing fuel and fire erupted on its right wing. It started to bank steeply to the right. Captain James McFerrin and First Officer Robert Fox fought to keep their aircraft in the air, but all their critical controls were jammed by the impact of the small plane.
This is it, baby. I love you.
Controllers in the tower radioed PSA and asked if they should send emergency equipment. There was no response. 13 seconds after impact with the small plane, the 727 exploded on the ground just north of San Diego's Balboa Park. Bill Callahan, a reporter for a local newspaper, was just a few blocks away when he heard the crash.
And I could just see this huge plume of black smoke. So then I started running and I went down about 2 or 3 blocks. I was pretty close. I think I was one of the first reporters there.
Reporter Gene Cubison was also there, and every time he returns to the scene, the events of that day remain etched in his memory.
I'm on the phone, as I recall, with a state senator. They were waving at the city desk, you know, phone down, let's go, and I wanted to be polite to the senator, and so I was kind of, yeah, and they just said, put the phone down, get up to North Park, there's been a crash at Dwight and Nile, jetliner, small plane.
Here was all this smoke and heat, and I remember I came around a corner, and here was, it was just surreal. There was part of a tail section sticking up.
It was a chaos, just burning metal here as the fuselage lay in the street.
Papers everywhere, and personal belongings and debris.
Paramedics were saying, ain't no survivors here. So a makeshift morgue was set up over at St. Augustine High School.
I saw some people rushing to that corner, and they were trying to stop someone. And one of the houses that had been littering was hers, and the neighbors didn't want her to see it. They were trying to stop her from seeing it.
The police were making arrests of photographers because there was a report that this may be a crime scene. It was thought that perhaps the lieutenant governor at the time, Mervyn Dimely, was on board. There were reports that Dave Winfield of the Padres was on board. None of that proved true.
There were 135 victims, 128 passengers, and 7 people on the ground. A dozen homes were destroyed. The Cessna was found in the same neighborhood 5 blocks away. Initial reports blamed the small plane's pilot, suggested he, quote, got in the way of the commercial jet.
Are we clear that Cessna? Supposed to be, I guess.
Oh yeah, before we turned downwind, I saw him at 1 o'clock. Probably behind us now.
There's one underneath. I was looking at that inbound there.
6 seconds later, the planes collided and then fell from the sky. As research for her book on another plane crash, journalist Moira Johnston studied many system failures. One in particular was the audible warning system installed in San Diego's control center just weeks prior to the accident.
That system's failure was failure of the air traffic control system, and that came down to human failure.
Accident investigators discovered a cry-wolf syndrome that existed at the air traffic control level. The controllers discounted the alert from the conflict warning system because so many of those alerts in the 40 days prior to the collision had been considered nuisance alerts and warranted no further action. The controllers further justified their decision to ignore the warnings because the flight crew on the PSA plane had actually acknowledged that they were in fact maintaining visual separation between the 2 planes, which means they can see the other aircraft and stay clear of it.
Okay, we've got that other 12.
Translation: because PSA could see the other plane, controllers believed there was no need for further action on their part.
In fact, it's the most chilling part of this crash, that a controller, when he's told by a pilot, as happened in the PSA crash, I've got it, I've got the aircraft, I see the Cessna, says, conflict resolved, and watches the 2 blips on the radar come together, merge, hears the collision alert warning go off, and still says to another man beside him who's watching it also, conflict has been resolved. That tells you everything about how imperfect radar is.
The Federal Aviation Administration was accused of not moving fast enough, for procrastinating over development of a more advanced collision avoidance system. Ironically, that same system had already been suggested in a report 6 years earlier.
All the aids that pilots could have had at the time of the PSA crash, they didn't have. Collision alert warnings, what they call heads-up displays in the cockpit so that you could see what's actually happening on your instruments while you're looking out of the cockpit. Better radars.
The NTSB urged the FAA to take action. David R. Kelly spent 27 years with the NTSB, specializing in air traffic control and operations.
NTSB repeatedly sent recommendation letters recommending that the FAA develop and implement a collision avoidance system.
The fight's been going on for years and years, but at that time was, what can we at least do with the logistics that we've got to make sure this will never happen again?
The crash of PSA prompted the introduction of something called the Terminal Control Area, or TCA.
What the FAA went ahead and did was to structure these TCAs around major airports.
When you get close to the airport, say 5 or 10 miles, you have an area that goes up from the surface to a given altitude, let's say 2,500 feet. An area surrounding a major airport that we would think of as an upside-down wedding cake. The next layer of cake would go out maybe 15, 20 miles, and then the top layer would go out 30 miles, and in each case you're increasing in altitude the size or volume of area.
And aircraft cannot go into these restricted airspace unless they're talking to air traffic control and get ATC authorization, segregating the aircraft that was not going to land there from aircraft that were going to land there. In other words, positive control airspace.
However, problems persisted in and around airports nationwide, even with the TCAs in operation. Former NTSB Deputy Chief of Air Traffic Control Richard Wentworth explains.
There are two sets of rules under which pilots operate. There's VFR, or Visual Flight Rules, and there's IFR, Instrument Flight Rules, under which all commercial air carriers operate. The Visual Flight Rules allow the general aviation enthusiast to go out and enjoy flying, yet remain out from under the encumbrances of air traffic control as long as he remains clear of airspace under which ATC guidance is required.
The facts were there on the mid-air collision problem. I mean, we were having mid-air collisions one every year.
NTSB recommendations urgently requested a full-scale terminal radar service area in San Diego and a restriction on the use of visual separation. Additional corrective actions were called for, but the FAA said it required more time to research the suggested changes. In the meantime, private pilots would share the responsibility of keeping the skies around airports safe by adhering to the TCA, or Terminal Control Area rules. These rules state that only authorized aircraft communicating with air traffic control are allowed in the TCA. But that means all pilots must know where the boundaries are. What if someone makes a mistake? Despite the safety recommendations following the San Diego tragedy, a very similar accident occurred about 7 years later. And again, it was over the skies of Southern California. The rules restricting air traffic in the Terminal Control Area, or TCA, were designed to prevent such accidents from happening. But air safety rules only work when everyone obeys them. Aeroméxico Flight 498 was on final approach into Los Angeles International Airport with 58 passengers and 6 crew on August 31st, 1986. At the same time, a privately owned Piper Archer carrying a family of 3 had departed Torrance Municipal Airport bound for the mountain community of Big Bear. Directly in his path was the Terminal Control Area, the TCA, of Los Angeles International Airport.
The DC-9 was proceeding normally to Los Angeles International. He was descending from 9,000 to 6,000 feet. They collided at about 6,500 feet. The Piper hit the vertical stabilizer and left horizontal stabilizer of the DC-9 and took it right off.
With the tail of the airplane virtually sheared off, Aeroméxico inverted and crashed nose first into the residential community of Cerritos, California. Upon impact, it demolished 5 homes and killed 15 residents on the ground.
As that Piper hit him, the horizontal stabilizer of the DC-9 took the top off of the Cherokee and killed those 3 people. By coincidence, Another, a Grumman American aircraft, climbed into the TCA thinking he had been cleared into the TCA, but he was looking for flight radar coverage and he had not been cleared in to that area. That distracted the controller who was handling Aeroméxico from paying attention to Aeroméxico.
When the controller turned his attention back to his other traffic, the Piper and Aeroméxico planes had disappeared from his screen.
There was no evasive action taken based on the collision angles.
The fact of it is, general piloting says if you're in visual conditions, you will conduct a normal scan from left to right. Well, the Cherokee was low and to his left.
We did a great deal of study about how conspicuous the targets were to each other, the DC-9 and the PA-28, using binocular camera for the human eye detection. And using the radar data, we could plot the relative positions of the aircraft one to the other. And we came to a conclusion that the Piper was not visible to the crew. They were in the field of vision, but the target size was not detectable until about 15 seconds before impact. The DC-9 was of a detectable size target, a little over a minute.
Studies also showed that at a great portion of that flight for the Cherokee, Aeroméxico was hid behind one of the pillars in the windscreen.
Air traffic control radar tapes clearly display the Piper on the radar screen that the controller was watching.
He should have seen it. In behalf of the controller, I would say that he had given traffic just a few minutes before the collision to Aeroméxico and watched that traffic disappear behind Aeroméxico. So, I mean, it wasn't that he was not paying attention or not doing his job, but there were certain things all happening within a very short period of time.
The controller, even though he may have perceived that target of the Piper moving eastbound on a collision course with Aeroméxico, had no reason to presume that our aircraft posed a threat by virtue of the fact that there was no altitude encoding on it. Therefore, he did not have any idea that this aircraft was climbing up into protected airspace.
Many airlines were already using an advanced form of radar, the Mode C transponder. It displays the plane's altitude on an air traffic controller's radar screen. But this was not being used in any of the three aircraft over Cerritos.
Mode C Intruder is a radar program designed to tell the controller that there is an aircraft out there that may present a potential conflict for the aircraft that he is indeed working.
Another system then under consideration was Conflict Alert, which warns pilots in an airplane so equipped about intruders to their airspace.
The transponders on these passenger carrying aircraft, they talk to each other.
It allows the pilot to know what is going on around him to the point that he will receive two alerts.
The first alert tells the pilot to visually observe traffic that could be in conflict with him. If one aircraft gets too close to the other, the crew will get a second alert, known as an RA, or Resolution Advisory. This is a specific instruction to climb or descend to avoid the other aircraft. Following Cerritos, the NTSB made its recommendations for this system, called TCAS-2, or Terminal Traffic Collision Avoidance System. In light of the fact that these same recommendations had been presented a long time before, much of the blame continued to be pointed at the FAA.
This went on for years, and we'd have another one. We'd send another letter. And quite frankly, the FAA fumbled along. They had numerous prototypes with acronyms. And the FAA was not aggressive in pursuing a solution to the problem. Finally, the Congress became so frustrated with the FAA, they mandated to the FAA that they implement TCAS-2.
It took 20 years of studies, procrastination, endless recommendations, and yes, the fatal collision above Cerritos before a TCAS-2 system was finally adopted.
Guess what? The results are startling. There hasn't been a mid-air collision involving air carrier aircraft in the United States since 1986, and that was at Cerritos, California.
Once again, a problem was identified, and through the use of new technology, the airline industry has greatly reduced the risks associated with the human factor. Commercial airplanes are among the most durable and dependable machines man has ever built. But like any machine, operating conditions, as well as the operator itself, will determine how well that machine performs, if it performs at all. The day was November 15th, 1987. Snow, gusty winds, and icy conditions hit Denver's Stapleton Airport in Colorado. Robert Link boarded a jet in Newark, New Jersey early that morning en route to a vacation in Idaho. He had to change planes in Denver, where he then became a passenger on Continental Airlines Flight 1713, a DC-9 bound for Boise.
When we arrived at Denver, we were in the middle of a major snowstorm.
Planes were already backed up at Stapleton by the time Link got there.
Now it's really snowing. Now I have flown in snow before, and this should not be an insurmountable object.
One of the great safety concerns in freezing weather is wing contamination, such as a thin layer of ice.
We were one of the first planes to be de-iced. We watched the de-icing compound come down, covered the whole plane, and I guess removed the ice.
Robert Benson was the investigator in charge for the National Transportation Safety Board.
We learned within the last few decades that a very small amount of ice on a wing surface can greatly affect the lift capability of the wings and the flyability of the aircraft. The ramp was very crowded that day because the snow had been backing up flights as the day progressed.
In fact, controllers on the ground at Denver were unaware that Flight 1713 had even taxied from its gate.
And Denver Tower, the number 1 Continental there at the runway 1713.
Roger, I have a Continental 594. Would that be anybody?
They lost us, the tower did, in traffic. I don't even know if they knew we were there.
1713, are you at MD-80?
Negative, sir, DC-9.
The tower for a few moments actually lost the location of the airplane, and in this long line of airplanes waiting to take off, the flight crew, for reasons, well, they will never know, never got out of line to go back to get de-iced again.
The man I was sitting next to said, you know, it looks like we have as much snow and ice on the wings as when we started. I made a comment to him. I said, I'm sure it's okay. I don't think these pilots want to kill themselves.
1713, runway 35 left, clear for takeoff.
We were in the air, I think, about 5 seconds. And at that point, the plane started to buck. Think of a roller coaster, of a plane doing this. Well, the moment that started, I don't know how many passengers started to scream on that airplane.
Then came the first report of trouble.
Tower, somebody just crashed on 35 left, big fireball.
The plane slammed back into runway 35.
We saw a big fireball on 35 left.
We came over too far to the port side, snapped off a wing, and turned upside down.
28 people on board Continental 1713 died. 54 other passengers, like Bob Link, were injured, 12 of them in critical condition. The crash site was closed until the NTSB arrived to begin its investigation into the worst disaster in the history of the Denver airport.
We always suspect mechanical objects, of course. They're never perfect. So we exhaustively tore down the engines in a forensic manner to try to figure out whether they were putting out the correct thrust. The flight controls on an airplane are always something we look at, the flaps and the ailerons and rudders and horizontal stabilizers and things. So these are all things that we eliminate piece by piece by piece until we come up with a final conclusion.
Pilot inexperience was suspected.
33 hours in one seat and 36 hours in the other seat is very little time. And that was one of the things this accident investigation brought out, was that to pair two people together in a complicated airplane with that little amount of experience is not a good idea. We thought it was just a completely botched takeoff on the part of the first officer without any extenuating factors. And it turns out there were. So it's yet another lesson never to jump to conclusions in this game. You have to eliminate everything, and then whatever's left is probably what happened.
Added to the inexperience of the pilots, ice contamination on the wing was indeed one of the probable causes of the accident.
The phenomenon of ice accretion on a wing is well known. There were many test flights have been done in the past before this accident. We tapped into a lot of that data.
But the professional flying community was stunned at the small amount of ice or frost it would take to jeopardize an aircraft.
We've discovered or rediscovered the fact that, at least on the DC-9-10, under a millimeter of frost can greatly affect lift capability. In fact, a surface as rough as medium sandpaper would really be dangerous on that airplane.
In 1987, the DC-9 was not equipped with any automatic or mechanical way for the pilots to determine how much ice was actually on the wings. So what happened when 1713 attempted to take off?
He rotated the aircraft. In other words, he brought the nose up a little quicker than was probably prudent, which would have been perfectly okay in a normal weather situation. But with this ice buildup on the wings, that caused the lift to degrade very quickly, so quickly that the captain couldn't take control and recover from the situation.
The aircraft stalled about 50 feet into the air, with not enough room underneath it to recover. So what did the NTSB recommend? That every plane be fitted with wing contamination detection devices?
The board actually thought that a better way would be to attack the time an aircraft is on the ground without being de-iced.
In 1987, when the crash occurred, the maximum allowable time between de-icing was supposed to be 20 minutes.
The accident aircraft actually spent 29 minutes on the ground before the takeoff was attempted. And during that time, a thin layer of frost or ice did build up on the wings.
The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the crash of Continental 1713 was upper wing surface contamination due to improper de-icing due to the plane's delay in departure, and over-rotation of the aircraft during takeoff. When those two things combined, disaster.
And in the end, we recommended that flight crew members of lesser experience never be paired together. Would that have saved the day if one person was more experienced than the other one? Who knows? But we know that two inexperienced people flying an airplane is never a good idea.
I don't even think about it anymore except when I have to buy an airplane ticket. And right now I have an airplane ticket in my pocket and I'm just looking forward to a good fishing trip. I'm not even thinking about the flying part. I have to remember, this is a good point, I suppose. It's still the safest way of transportation.
In each of the accidents we've looked at, human fallibility played a very big part. To reduce the chances of those accidents happening again, new technologies and procedures were put in place. Technologies and procedures designed to minimize the human factor.